Good evening, and welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's public program, Female Genius, with Mary Sarah Bilder. We come to you from the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain an active presence here in central Massachusetts. I'm Scott Casper, president of the American Antiquarian Society. We have some newcomers here this evening, so I'll say a few words of introduction to our society, which is a national research library located in Worcester, Massachusetts. We collect, preserve, and share materials printed or produced before 1900 in what's now the United States, portions of Canada, and the Caribbean. Our collections include books and pamphlets, newspapers and periodicals, manuscripts, and the graphic arts and ephemera. AAS supports and welcomes scholars and readers from around the country and indeed around the world to use our reading room or to seek out digitized materials on our website. We also offer regular programming like tonight's virtual program. This evening's program is the fifth in our series, Women Make History, and previous programs in this series and others are available on our YouTube channel. You can go to our website for continual updates, including other series related to nature and the environment, artists in the archive, history of the book, and perspectives from the collections, programs that consider one object in our collections from multiple areas of expertise. We thank you for joining us this evening, and as a nonprofit organization, we welcome any support you can provide to help keep this work going. Thank you. For those unfamiliar with Zoom, my colleague, Kevin Wisniewski, will be sharing a few notes in the chat on how to use the Zoom webinar functions. Kevin will also be posting links and relevant information in the chat throughout the program. To open the chat, click the chat box icon located on the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to remind everyone that this program is being recorded and will be made available on our website and YouTube channel within the next few weeks. And as Kevin is putting in the chat, if you want to ask questions of our speaker, please enter them on the Q&A box at the bottom, through the Q&A box, which you can find at the bottom of your screen as well. Now, it is my pleasure to introduce Mary Sarah Bilder, who is Founders Professor of Law at Boston College Law School. Professor Bilder has written two previous books, both of them prize winners. The Transatlantic Constitution, Colonial Legal Culture and the Empire was awarded the Littleton Griswold Award from the American Historical Association. Her book, Madison's Hand, Revising the Constitutional Convention, won the 2016 Bancroft Prize in American History and Diplomacy, which is among the most prestigious awards in the field of American history. That book also won the James C. Bradford Prize for Biography from the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic. Mary Sarah Bilder's new book, Female Genius, Eliza, Harriet, and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution, appeared from the University of Virginia Press this spring. It is a remarkable work of intellectual history and detective work about a remarkable woman, Eliza Harriet Barons O'Connor. Dr. Bilder has joined us tonight to talk about this fascinating story. Mary Sarah Bilder, welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's virtual talks.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here tonight and in conversation with you, Scott.
That's great. And I'm going to turn it over to you to share a PowerPoint and talk a bit about the book and give us an introduction to the book before we begin our conversation.
That's great. So Kevin's going to handle the PowerPoint slides, and hopefully everyone can see them there. They're going to be a little bit to my right, so you're going to have to forgive me if I glance over. And we have on the first slide here the cover of the book and the epigraph of the book. And this is a particularly wonderful place to speak, because a lot of the book's research comes from newspapers, and the AAS has been such a wonderful preserver of newspapers, and really without institutions, particularly the AAS, but other institutions that have preserved newspapers from this period, this book would not be possible. And the kind of work in recovering someone like Eliza Harriet wouldn't be possible. So I'm just incredibly, incredibly grateful. The epigraph that you see on the screen here is what a woman who the book is about, in part, Eliza Harriet Behrens O'Connor, which was her full name, wrote in a newspaper in Philadelphia. And I'm going to read it out loud because it really embodies a theory that she had, a theory that other women like her shared, and a theory that I think is incredibly important as a lesson about the significance of her life. So she wrote in the newspaper, in advertisements she placed, "The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved upon by future candidates for literary fame." And that's really in some ways the story that the book tries to tell, and in some ways the story that the book recovers. So Kevin, maybe we can go to the next slide here. The book really thinks about the framing period, and people who maybe know Madison's Hand, which has no women whatsoever in it, might understand how this book relates in ways to it. When we think about the framing period, our images don't include women. And you can see on the slide, probably the two most famous images of the writing of the Constitution, Barry Faulkner's image in the National Archives, and then Howard Chandler Christie's in giant mural in the House of Representatives. And even though Faulkner included someone who wasn't actually at the signing, and Christie placed everybody outdoors, where obviously you could have included other people, our image has really been what Jefferson called it, right? An assembly of demigods, all white men. And the late great Jan Ellen Lewis, in thinking about how do we think about women's relationship to the Constitution, noted that there are women there, but as she put it, they're quite shadowy, and you have to turn the lights up quite bright to see them. And that's partly what this project does. Now, in thinking about Jefferson's phrase, an assembly of demigods, we might remember that Clio, the muse of history, is actually a demigoddess. And Clio is the daughter of Zeus, right, who symbolizes power, and then also the Titaness Mnemosyne, who symbolizes memory. And she serves as a reminder to us that what history is about, in some ways, is the way in which what we remember creates power. And Clio, as the muse of history, actually served as a sort of beacon and image for a number of very remarkable women. Here we see Frances Anne Ackland painted with Clio by Angelica Kaufman in the period I'm going to talk about. And Angelica Kaufman was perhaps one of the most famous women portrait painters of her generation. So maybe we can go to the next slide, Kevin. So I've been interested in a long time in thinking about this period, not as about framers, but about what I call a framing generation. Thinking about ways that we can broaden our lens to incorporate all sorts of other people whose pressures, personalities, very existence influenced the Constitution as a system of government. And when I wrote my book, Madison's Hand, which is about Madison's notes of the convention, one of the things that I did was read all of the existing diaries that exist for the summer of 1787. And one of my favorites is actually the diary that George Washington kept that summer, because he only reported what he did outside of the convention, instead of being inside the convention. And he didn't bring his right diary, so he went home in the fall to Mount Vernon and actually then wrote a revised diary. And in both the original rough draft of the diary and the revised diary, there's this interesting diary entry that struck me at the time, and then I've taught it, and then I puzzled about it, and then I finally decided to write about her. And on Friday, May 18th, Washington was in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. The Virginia delegates had shown up on time, and they were waiting for everyone else to have a quorum. And Washington wrote the representation from New York appeared on the floor today, dined at Gray's Ferry, and drank tea at Mr. Morris's, after which accompanied Mrs. Morris and some other ladies to hear a Mrs. O'Connell read, a charity affair. The lady, being reduced in circumstances, had had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. Her performance was tolerable at the college hall. Now, those of us who are Austen fans might remember that the word tolerable is perhaps one of the most important in Pride and Prejudice. It's what Darcy says when he meets Eliza Bennet for the first time. She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me. And tolerable has a much more acceptable meaning in this period than we might think today. Jane Austen, of course, started what became Pride and Prejudice as First Impressions in 1797, so just about the end of the period I'm going to talk about. And this entry really stuck with me. Who was she? What was she doing? What was her significance? I started working on her, and then Carolyn Eastman, the wonderful historian of women's oratory, introduced me to Granville Ganter, who is also working on her from the perspective that he writes on, and he's written a wonderful essay about her. So let me talk a little bit about her. But before I do, let me talk about the book. Kevin, maybe we can go to the next slide. There's two concepts that really illuminate the argument in the book. And the book is really a story both of recovering the story of Eliza Harriet Barons O'Connor, and also then trying to think about how does it fit into the story of women's relationship to the constitutional state. And in doing that, I make two kinds of argumentative moves with respect to concepts. So first of all, I argue this is an age of the Constitution, and that the Constitution, in the way that we come to think of it as a written document, somewhat circumscribed by the writing, interpreted by the judiciary, that genre hasn't yet really developed or been solidified. And instead, throughout this period, even throughout 1787, the word Constitution continues to carry with it its older meaning of a system or frame of government. And so it's beginning to shift, but not entirely. And that's important in understanding the ways in which so many people outside of Independence Hall were arguing for greater representation. And that's transatlantically true, right, in England, France, and Ireland. So one thing the book does is it makes an argument about how we think about Constitution. In some ways, this is very similar to the way that Linda Colley's new book has thought about Constitution. And then the book thinks about how did people imagine women and the issue of women's relationship to the state. And what one finds in this period, really beginning in the 1770s into the 1780s, is there's an outpouring of ways in which people engage with a concept that I call female genius. And that's actually a word that appears over and over and over again in this period. And what female genius sort of embodied was a moment where people, particularly women, imagined that they could finally overturn this inferiority thesis, the sort of concept that women were inferior and therefore all these things followed. And you can see how that idea shifts here. Here we have Rousseau in one of the translations published in this period of Emile. Which would you esteem the most, a woman whom you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex and her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette and surrounded with pamphlets of all sort? And so this is a woman writing or a woman reading political pamphlets. And this word female genius shows up in association with all sorts of different women. The place where I first really came to understand it is in a remarkable poem written in 1774 by Mary Scott, where she describes all the female geniuses she knows. And amongst them is Phillis Wheatley, the great poet who had recently visited London and met the the Blue Stockings and other women. We see the Blue Stockings portrayed here in 1774 in Richard Samuel's portrait. And then Catherine Macaulay, the great constitutional historian, depicted in many portraits and actually a statue. And then if we start thinking about this idea of female genius, we can see it expand. This is a period when, for example, women's debating societies exist in London and actually explicitly debate women's political representation and membership in the House of Commons. And we can then expand that to think about how this explains women's, the novel, the rise of the novel, the rise of women as owners and participants in circulating libraries, and that. So Eliza Harriet is of this moment where we have this idea of female genius. And so, Kevin, maybe you can go to the next slide. So who was Eliza Harriet Behrens? She was born Eliza Harriet Behrens. Her father was Benjamin Behrens. Aficionados of Boston in the 1760s may know that he's the demon port collector who sides with Otis against the British and is therefore knocked out. Her mother is part of the Hardy family, and the Hardys were governors of New York and New Jersey. They're a prominent admiralty family, and you can see this beautiful George Romney portrait of her uncle, Sir Charles Hardy, for whom her father worked, and her cousin, Catherine Hardy. And in June of 1776, she marries a man identified as John O'Connor of the Inner Temple. The only people to show up for their wedding are his family. And he's somewhat mysterious, but from Sligo. He's Irish Catholic, probably gone to Trinity College, and in London to attend the Inns of Court. And they get married and then spend time both in Dublin and London, really participating in this sort of flourishing liberal political reform, oratory, elocution world. So Kevin, maybe we can go to the next slide, because they then move across the Atlantic in 1786. They come first to New York, and over the next basically 6 or 7 years, they will move progressively southward, following basically what was the King's Highway. By 1787, they will be in Philadelphia. And then basically over the next series of years, they will go down south to all of these different cities. Usually Eliza Harriet, John's off trying to make money. He's very unsuccessful at enterprises, and she's the main support. And in this sense, they are what Granville Ganter has nicely called entrepreneurial lecturers. Her practice will be to give a lecture and try and then set up a female academy. And in moving in this direction, she will always refer to herself as a lady. And we want to emphasize and think about the way in which, as a white woman with a British accent, with claims to basically an uncle who was governor of New York and knighted, that carried a kind of status and aspirational identity that's very much also tied to sort of the construction of whiteness as a race. And she will actually be most successful in Charleston, where the significant enslaved economy probably helps her school. And so that's a part of the background of her story we don't want to lose track of. So what does she do in Philadelphia? Well, Kevin, if we go to the next slide, in the spring of 1787, in April, she starts advertising for lectures by a lady in the university. And she gives a course of lectures. She's, as far as I know, to date, the first woman in the United States to give a course of lectures, never mind at a university. And she prominently advertises that. And she describes her own lectures as an anonymous correspondence, saying that basically the female character should assume the station and honors due to professors of science. And then while Europe hears with envy that the toilette and the drawing room are deserted for the forum and the college. So she has this grand ambition about the college, right? Basically state-sponsored higher education, and the forum with its aspirational ideas towards political representation. She gives at least 5 lectures in the early spring and summer in Philadelphia. Washington will attend the one on May 18th. She will advertise almost every day in this newspapers in the summer of 1787, usually in multiple newspapers. There's over 140 advertisements of her sort of lectures. And we can talk more about the nature of her lectures. And that wasn't all she did, Kevin. If we go to the next slide, she also wanted to create a sort of ambitious female academy, a belles lettres academy that she was going to call the French Academy of Philadelphia, or the Belles Lettres Academy. And she imagined this as governed by women. The board was to be 50-50, 50 men, 50% men, 50% women, with a woman governess, run by majority rule. That's what she says. And so women will always have the majority votes, and the woman leading it would always give public lectures. And she actually tries to get Sarah, I've got her name reversed here, Franklin Bache, interested in her. There's an extant letter from that. And Anne Bingham may have been inspired by Eliza Harriet's ambition when she sort of writes to Jefferson in the summer of 1787. And this is where she sort of describes her idea that what a woman does is she presents an example to be imitated and then improved on. So she sees herself as the first step. Now, she never gets that academy started, because now we enter the villain in the story. The next slide, Kevin, is Benjamin Rush, who's usually a good guy. But in my story, he becomes a person desiring to get Eliza Harriet out of Philadelphia. And so the book argues that his very famous Thoughts Upon Female Education, which has become the sort of text of the Republican motherhood argument, is actually a conservative argument designed to get rid of Eliza Harriet and her kind of ambitious idea about female education. And in fact, we can then reinterpret this very influential pamphlet by thinking about it in a new way. So when Rush says a peculiar mode of education, and then he cabins every description of what women are going to learn with an adverb or adjective describing that it won't be quite what men do, we can now see that he's actually not the kind of liberal beacon of education that he somehow interpreted. And we can then also hear in his argument an uncomfortable type of nativism. So one of the most famous lines in his pamphlet is where he describes that what women should aspire to is to be an agreeable companion for a sensible man, the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And we think of him writing this, first he gave it as a speech, thinking about Eliza Harriet, a woman with a British accent, married to an Irish Catholic man. And the American citizen piece suddenly maybe feels a little bit different. Well, Eliza Harriet was obviously part of a much larger movement. And so now, Kevin, if we go to these next slides, she reminds us that we can now think about Mary Wollstonecraft and Catherine Macaulay and other women and see in them the same arguments, the same aspirations of Eliza Harriet. So Mary Wollstonecraft's first book, written in 1787 on sort of education, is Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. And Catherine Macaulay will also write a book on women's education. And then Mary Wollstonecraft writes, and anonymously as a Mr. Creswick, a female reader. This is one of the things that Eliza Harriet will push as an educational mode, that women should give orations. And only then does Wollstonecraft come to argue the vindication. And of course, it's in the vindication that she basically argues for women's political representation. And the vindication of the rights of woman was actually quite popular in the United States. Originally, here we see the first issue of the Philadelphia Ladies magazine with a beautiful woodcut showing the genius of the magazine and the genius of emulation, presenting the rights of woman to liberty. And we know that this idea of women participating in politics is not unknown. So if we see on the next slide, we can see women voted in New Jersey. This was also true of African Americans in this period. Beginning, the New Jersey Constitution had only the word inhabitant. It was not unusual in that period. And we know, this is an 1801 poll list, that a significant number of women vote in this period. So the idea that Eliza Harriet has is not unknown. It's not completely surprising. And then this is, Carolyn Eastman calls this really one of the most remarkable speeches in this period. This is just about 5 or 6 years after Eliza Harriet spoke in Philadelphia. This is at the school that Rush promotes, the Young Ladies Academy. And here's the young Priscilla Mason. I like to imagine she might have heard Eliza Harriet saying, right, supposing we possessed all the talents of the orator, where shall we find a theater for the display of them? The church, the bar, the senate are shut against us. Who shut them? Man, despotic man. Let us by suitable education qualify us for those high departments, and they will open before us. And Mason actually goes on to argue that there's no rules preventing women from being lawyers. So we have this period where suddenly it seems like female genius might actually get a toehold, but next slide, that turns out not to be the case. Eliza Harriet's financial situation worsens in 1792, caught in the sort of financial collapse in the United States. And this parallels in all sorts of interesting ways the possibility of women's inclusion in the constitutional state. As people begin to understand the new genre of the written constitution, one of the things that happens is people in power, white men, realize that constitutions become a very powerful way of keeping other people out of power. And beginning in 1792 and moving through the first 3/4 of the 19th century, gradually states shift arguably open constitutions to describing political participants by male and actually increasingly as white male citizens. And this becomes the sort of basis of the argument for expanding democracy. Land restrictions fall away, but we get this restriction. In this period where even New Jersey reverses and actually allows only free white male citizens to vote, Eliza Harriet's life comes to an end. She dies in 1811 in Columbia. She's living in one room in someone's house, and this is her list. She actually bothered to write a will giving her few possessions that she had left away. But we can't end on such a sad note, so we'll go to the last slide here. Eliza Harriet reminds us of the influence that she had by her advertisements and by her lectures. This is a wonderful postcard where we see 3 images of women described in various ways as people advocating for the vote, with Washington rising from his chair. Did I save my country for this? I would say, yes, he did. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mary. This is a terrific presentation about a fascinating book. And one of the things that I found remarkable in reading the book is how you've pieced together Eliza Harriet's life from really very fragmentary evidence. The biggest part of the evidence is the advertisements in the newspapers. So I thought maybe we could talk a little bit about her and her life and how you put it together. She is very much a transatlantic character. She's born in Portugal. She's raised and educated partly in England. She's married to an Irishman. She lives in Ireland for a while before they even come to North America and then the United States. What difference do you think her transatlantic experience and life made for her ideas and her ambitions?
Yeah, it's such a great question. And, I think one of the things she really reminds us is, particularly in a place like Philadelphia, but this is true of so many of the cities in the United States, how many people who we forget that they're immigrants. You know, they take, a lot of them take on other names. We can't hear their accents. We can't hear the way they spoke or who they hung out with. But so in some ways, you know, she's really a reminder of that aspect. I think one of the things that her family background is so important for is her mother's family and her father really taught her about the importance of political patronage. She grew up in a world sophisticated with that sort of, you know, 18th century claw your way out of your economic positions. And I think she brings that with her. She very quickly latches on to the idea that Washington's a way to amplify her message. And she really works to make sure that Washington comes to her lectures, knowing that if he shows up, every newspaper in the United States is going to cover it, which is why she exists today.
That's how we know about her, really, is that she's in those newspapers. It's interesting because she comes from this family, as you mentioned, that this background with relatives who are office holders and they're aristocrats. And it's almost as though the entire story of your book from when she gets to the United States is about downward mobility.
Yeah.
It's really about, you know, class and status and how precarious her economic situation is, in part because her husband has so little success in anything he undertakes.
Yeah, no, he's remarkably unsuccessful. His ideas are actually good. You know, he thinks of an American geography, but it will be Jedediah Morse who does that. You know, he has actually really good ideas. It's just somebody else does them a little bit better. And actually somebody else is usually backed by someone else. So it reminds us about how many things that turn out to be successful basically are people with connections to investors. You know, there's a economic structure behind that. He also reminds us about ever-present debt and the sort of precariousness of that. She's the bread earner for her family. She's you know, without her capacity to give lectures and open schools, they would have had no income. She also sort of, I think, emphasizes, and the book doesn't do a lot with this, but the way in which there is a kind of class aspect to the United States. That's one of the things she's sort of selling. And there's a wonderful advertisements she writes where she writes about how she will teach sewing, not just common sewing, but the types of embroidery that will allow young women to look like they had basically acquired more expensive clothes. So she's very conscious of, even as she's on this downward trajectory that even Washington understands, how having people believe you have more money and you come from a certain social background, sort of keeps her afloat. And that is kind of what keeps her afloat for a long time. But she's a really interesting example of that. And her life is, she's just remarkably ambitious and determined in the face of, you know, I think they're pretty much skipping across state lines to flee creditors most of their lives.
Does seem that way. That, you know, the map in your book is remarkable. That, you know, she's in Philadelphia, she's in New York, and then she's in this. Well, then she's around Georgetown, around DC, and then eventually to the South. And throughout, she's trying to establish these female academies. So maybe could you tell us a bit about what a female academy looked like in the late 1700s in the United States? Either what we know about hers, or we know about other female academies. What happened there? What did young women study? Who was teaching them? What happened in the classroom?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question. My great-great-grandmother was a school teacher, so I sort of am personally always thinking, like, I wonder what she was like as a school teacher. You know, we're lucky here because we can identify the school that she probably went to. She went to a Mrs. Aylesworthy's outside of London, Chelsea. She would have been there at the same time that John Wilkes's daughter was there. And so she goes to a school that's teaching French, and that's ambitious in that aspect. French is configured very importantly in this book with its reminder that this is the language of the Enlightenment, and it's the language of sort of female political ambition. And so learning French is a way to be cosmopolitan. It will eventually be configured in a kind of feminized, not serious way, but it's not in that period. In fact, Washington thinks it's a waste of time to teach his grandnephew's Latin, he says, that's just a waste of time. So one of the things that she emphasizes in all of her schools, in addition to geography, she teaches math, she will eventually teach astronomy in Charleston, is she emphasizes the art of reading. And what that is elocution or oratory. And she's part of this emphasis on public speaking, which is true for so much of male education. And she probably picked that up partly from her own training, but particularly because they're in Dublin at the time that the Sheridans and Samuel White are emphasizing this. And so it's this notion of learning how to speak, learning how to read, and by doing that to put yourself out in the public. And Wollstonecraft has a wonderful phrase in which she describes why the art of reading is so important. And she says, because she sort of says, it's not probably a breach of modesty for a woman to obtrude herself on the public if she's doing it under the cover of sort of reading. And so in that sense, this is what she emphasizes. And over again, all of her advertisements, this is one of the big emphases. But other than Latin, her schools look like male education. And in fact, in New York, at this very successful school she ran before her husband took off for Philadelphia, she persuaded the professors of Columbia College to give the public examinations. The interesting question about her is she's so expansive in her advertisements that you'd have to do a very careful PhD level study. But a lot of advertisements seem to move towards her notion of female education. So her advertisements may be very influential in creating a new kind of idea about what a sort of fancy girl school, sophisticated education should look like.
There's so much to pick up on there. And one point is this point about elocution and reading. Yeah. Is part of the notion there that if women are reading aloud, say from literature or from classics, somehow they are speaking ideas that are already formed? Where do the ideas of the women themselves come into the picture?
Yeah, so she actually she changed her lectures that she gives in Philadelphia look a lot like Hugh Blair's, except she changes them by emphasizing she will talk about criticism. So that's a different way of thinking. When she advertises in Baltimore, she will emphasize that she wrote the lecture herself. So she will read passages, but there's clearly an argumentative section. And it's she has no papers, she had no children. But piecing things together, people may have heard her say things. So a nice example of this is at the speech that Washington attends, she gives Demosthenes' oration from The Crown, which was the great political set piece. Every young male framer sort of learns it. And that shows up in the papers, particularly in Rhode Island, as a critique of the missing Rhode Island delegation. And so one wonders who decided to put that there? Did she say something, or did she just say, well, I'm going to say this oration, the plea on the crown? So it would be, we would love to have a text. We don't have a text of her lectures, and that's just sort of guessing. What's interesting is that I was able to reconstruct a lot of her lectures from her own advertisements, and that suggests that any reader of the newspaper could do that also. So she's probably the first promoter of Sir William Jones's poetry in the United States. And she actually produces 2 poems emphasizing Washington using his words. So she's a really quite remarkable person in that regard.
She is. And we have questions coming in on the Q&A. I'm going to bring in some of those interspersed with my own. Carolyn Eastman writes.
Hey, Carolyn.
Yeah, what a wonderful talk. I'd be so curious for you to speak more about your argument about Harriet's ideas about gender equality in education as well as politics. How far can we go to argue that she really believed in an absolute kind of gender equality?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't know how far one would think about absolute gender equality. I do think that when you see her correspondent, sort of what she's imagining, which in some ways is like a better version of Noah Webster's lectures. And when she describes the idea, she's this anonymous correspondent, or her husband is, who says the point is to leave the toilette and the parlor, which were the two areas that women really did participate in, for the college and the forum. I think that's an ambitious idea about women's participation. And, I connect the dots between that, the constitutional, the neutral, gender neutral constitution, and the New Jersey voting. And there's other pieces, that go into that puzzle. But I think, Carolyn, you're totally right. Like, you can't say there's a absolutist idea. Even Wollstonecraft and Catherine Macaulay are sort of working their way towards that. But in some ways, it's almost like once you get exclusion, then you have to make the argument for inclusion. She's in a period where it isn't yet clear that women are going to get excluded completely from the constitutional state. And so I think that's why her rhetoric feels a little bit different. It's a great question.
Yeah. Richard Brown asks, please tell us more about the economics of her lectures and academies. What do we know from what we've got, from the newspaper advertisements and other information?
Yeah, so she runs a lot of advertisements. One of the things that was interesting to me is that in at least two of the cities, if not possibly also three of the cities, the first place she places an advertisement is a newspaper associated with a woman. So she starts with the Independent Gazetteer, which is Elizabeth Holt Oswald's running half the time. In Baltimore, she will go with Mary Catherine Goddard and advertise there. So she's looking for other women to be in support of her, which I think is a quite interesting thing. She advertises, she's trying to run a subscription series because that way you get the money up front and all you have to do is show up for the lectures. So it's clear that she probably isn't wholly successful in the subscriber, the big money coming in. She's aiming at a female audience. So in one of her advertisements, she describes that one ticket gets 3 women in, or 2 women and a man. And I don't know what you did if you were 3 men. Like, I don't quite know how that worked. But she's interesting in that she's, if you think about the University Hall in Philadelphia, that's the main hall where lots of other people are speaking, and she's filling it with a not Noah Webster hears her, but she's filling it with a lot of women. And so it's a very interesting economic model in which she's both encouraging everyone to come, but also encouraging women. But Granville Ganther has a nice piece in this piece he writes about entrepreneurial lecturers, and there's other later women, about the goal being, you had to get the money up front. For her, the money is probably to try and fund the school. So she's not a woman who just keeps wanting to lecture. What she really wants to do is teach, I think. But it's a great question.
It's a great question. And, I'm wondering, did she have to pay to advertise in the newspapers? Were the advertisements also cost her money? I don't know.
Yeah, the advertisements probably cost her money. I mean, you can tell. There's people, I'm sure, on this call who know a lot more about that than me. You can tell by the last little slash, word, how many times she placed the advertisement. Right. And that was helpful to me in finding all the advertisements. Like, you can be like, oh, okay, there's probably one in this. But what's pretty interesting is she spent a lot of money on advertising. She runs advertisements for almost all of the summer, and in most of the cities, the southern newspapers obviously have vanished, but even there, in the few extant newspapers, you can find her. So she's placing a lot of ads. When Washington comes to Charleston in his southern tour, she will actually up the number of ads that she places, sort of obviously trying to be recognized by him. So she's quite sophisticated in that sense about it.
Yeah, you mentioned Washington, and I think that let's turn to George Washington, because the subtitle of your book is Eliza Harriet and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution. he enters her story really just twice. When he attends her 1787 lecture in Philadelphia, and then she visits Mount Vernon the following year. But there are also interesting parallels, and you've mentioned one of them. He takes these presidential tours throughout the states, and you have the map of her own successive relocations. In some ways, though, as I was reading the book, I thought, well, Washington's kind of a minor figure in the book about a book about women's intellect and education. What led you to include him in the title? Why is he there?
Well, at a sort of evidentiary fact, but for her connections to Washington, which she was very determined to make, we wouldn't know about her. She exists in the newspapers. Lots of the stuff in the newspapers is about him attending her lectures. And so we can see her there. Of the 5 extant letters, 4 of them are to Washington. So, and one is to Benjamin Franklin's daughter. So there might be more now, some people may find more, but those are the 5 that are known. So he's important as an evidentiary piece. He's important because he actually does support her. He's supportive. She visits Mount Vernon. She actually gets him to send a carriage when she says, she invites herself, basically. He says, come on. Then she says, I don't have a carriage. He sends a carriage. So he's important in reminding us of the degree to which she appeared to be sort of this level of English class that she actually didn't have the financial aspects to. You're right, they follow the same geography. So they remind us in some ways about the length of the United States, but he's also very important because he reminds us about, in a funny way, he stands for this sort of constitutional state configured as white male. And that's certainly the way we imagine it. But then if we think about what he himself said about her, which is she was tolerable. I mean, he wasn't willing to embrace her completely. We might rethink how we think about the restricted nature of the white male constitutional state. And one of the things that I love is Washington kept a list of the books that he bought at the end of the summer. And he bought, as he left Philadelphia, 3 books that were inspired by her lectures, 1 poems that she read, another about oratory and elocution, and the 3rd about geography. So he was influenced by her. And when he goes to pick a school for Martha's basically granddaughters, I guess, he picks a school that looks a lot like her kind of school in Philadelphia. He doesn't send them to the sort of rush Protestant male-run young ladies academy. He sends them to a school run by basically the painter Pine's wife. So, he's a complicated figure. Lastly, I would just say, I think that Eliza Harriet always knew that just as Eliza Harriet, nobody would pay any attention to her. And so I do feel she would have approved mightily of the inclusion of Washington in the title of the book.
That's great. We have a question from one of our attendees. And this goes back to your point about constitutions. Why did New Jersey give women the vote if most of the time the vote was only given to people who owned property, in parentheses, the males?
Yeah, so this is one of the things that's really, really interesting, I think. Property is restricted by land holding, but it wasn't actually in this period restricted by gender. Now, Massachusetts Constitution is actually unusual in that regard because it uses the word male. But most constitutions, frames of government as they're being written, don't have sex restrictions in them. And this is true in England. We actually know that Ignatius Sancho, the first African descendant voter, votes in the 1770s. So the argument in the book is that we look back and we see explicit sex, race restrictions, but those actually aren't there. Those, Virginia will have it, of course, with respect to race. Those come later. And so the argument of the book is we're in this period where actually things are surprisingly open. New Jersey wrote a constitution that said inhabitants. And then in 1790 actually passes a statute that makes it explicit that it includes women voters. They pass a statute that says he or she. Alexander Hamilton, when he sets up Patterson in the same period, will actually allow for male and female stockholders and voters. So the idea of the book is that this is in a period where it's open. And then beginning after 1792, what we see is as people begin to understand the power of the written Constitution as a genre, that it excludes people in a particularly profound and sticky way, states begin to shift their constitutions to make sure that the people in power will always be the people in power. And that begins in Kentucky, at the same time as we have the Militia Act, the Federal Militia Act, which is one of the first examples of a sort of white race idea with federal law. And it will then continue progressively right through the period until New Jersey itself flips its own Constitution in 1807 from inhabitants. So the Massachusetts Constitution, because I went through all of them, is really actually remarkably unusual. And the federal Constitution, one of the arguments in the book is that when we think about the federal Constitution, there are examples in the drafting of the federal Constitution that have explicit words referencing sex. Most, I think, significantly, the fugitive slave law. When the fugitive slave law is proposed, its original language says he or she. And I just think it's such a testament to African-American women's agency that, whoever, probably Pierce Butler or the Pinckneys, who proposes that, can't say who he imagines escaping without emphasizing women. You think of Oni Judge, for example. And so all of those gender references are erased. And the Constitution ends up in its final draft with a completely neutral person, he, usage, and that includes the interstate rendition clause, which applies to women, that uses the same thing. So in that sense, we then suddenly see the Constitution is open, arguably, semantically, to the possibility of being read the way the New Jersey Constitution is. And that's important in the history of women's suffrage, because the 19th Amendment just says the states can't disenfranchise people. You never have to be enfranchised. The argument is always been that the states disenfranchised people, that the fundamental core was women were included in the constitutional state, and that the states disenfranchised people. And that's something I find persuasive. Probably not everyone will find it persuasive, but I find it persuasive.
Fascinating. And I found it persuasive the way you describe it. I want to turn now, we've got about 8 or 9 minutes left, and we have several questions, one of mine, but also an anonymous attendee asks, how did you come across Eliza? Which relates to my question, because this is an incredible work of historical detection. Could you tell us a bit more about how you traced her and her ideas? You mentioned at the beginning, the newspapers, how did you trace the sources and the clues?
Yeah, well, this is, she's not unknown. She shows up in the Washington papers. She shows up in Thomas Woody's great history of women's education. She actually shows up in 2 different places. He didn't realize she was the same person. I don't think most people would realize it was the same person in multiple cities. For me, this is where, sometimes as historians, we bemoan the sadness of everything changing, but the digital technologies that allow newspapers to be digitized, I think, is earth-shattering. One of the things that digital newspaper technology allowed me to do was to search almost every word in her advertisements. And I was lucky because she has favorite words that she uses over and over again. And so I was able to search over and over again to find those words. And so I think at the end, I found over 300 advertisements of hers, which is pretty significant. Advertisements or correspondence comments about her. Now, lots of those are in the 18th century, anything that was interesting, gets repeated by other newspapers. And so that's why her influence is so extensive, because the college and the forum piece is repeated in many, many newspapers. The Southern newspapers are significantly missing, and so it's harder. And she spent a lot of time in the South, so there's probably originally were far more. But and I've probably missed a lot. Looking for O apostrophe Connor is really hard. Search engines don't like that. Lady shows up all over the place. It took a lot of time. One of the things that was fun for me is there's E. O'Connor, who wrote 2 novels in this period, and some of that story behind those novels and the phrases in those novels match some of her advertisement. So I can't prove that she wrote 2 novels, but it would be typical of a lot of sort of aspiring women in this period to have tried their hand at this new genre of the novel. And so 2 novels, one of which was reviewed very negatively by Mary Wollstonecraft, probably pretty accurately, might have also been hers.
Fascinating. And then you also found fragmentary evidence of him. I noticed that in various places you found letters that one of them wrote that ended up in the dead letter office, or letters written to them that were in dead letter offices.
He actually had a fabulous idea. He decides to write. I mean, he's always got fabulous ideas, but he decides to write a history of the United States. And he creates a subscription base. Everybody's into the subscriber thing, sort of like you're a startup, you get all the money in, and who knows if you're going to win or not win. One of those subscription books actually exists at the library company. And then as he went off to talk to great men about the history of the United States, particularly the American Revolution, and no history appeared. And so one of the ways you can trace him is that angry subscribers started writing him at various cities, only to have those letters end up in the dead letters box. But yeah, no, it was fun. I mean, it was kind of, it was a different kind of detective work, and praise them. I suspect there's a portrait of her somewhere, or I would have thought there was at least a miniature done of her. And so I hope someday somebody finds that. But writing about people whose names are Elizabeth and John O'Connor, it reminds us of all the ways we have to be careful about identification. So there's another John O'Connor in Philadelphia. There's another John O'Connor who's actually even also a lawyer in Dublin. And so you have to, it was a really great exercise in being super careful that the person I was arguing about was in fact the same person.
It's the right Eliza Harriet.
Yeah, I had to make sure I was right. She signed herself Eliza Harriet in her will and in her letters. So, if there are other letters out there, they should be pretty easy to identify.
Yeah. Michael Huflick asks, did she ever arrange to have her individual lectures printed as separate pamphlets?
Oh, Michael, I wish. I so wish she had done that, because that would be wonderful. She doesn't. And so we don't have that. What she does arrange to have printed are 2 excerpts from Sir William Jones's poetry that she has in the paper. And then her husband actually says, I'll produce an edition of Sir William Jones, first in the United States. So they think about it that way. But to my knowledge, she doesn't have any of them printed, or I haven't found them. But the book ends with a woman, Charlotte Rollin, who was born exactly 100 years after Eliza Harriet and lives in Columbia, South Carolina, educated in a French school, educated very similarly to Eliza Harriet. And she's an African-American woman who, when the South Carolina legislature in 1869 asks for a lady to come and argue for impartial suffrage, she goes and argues for impartial suffrage before the South Carolina legislature. And her speech is also reported widely, including in the New York Times, which writes a very racist version of her speech. And unlike Eliza Harriet, she has the money or somebody else has the money to print that speech. And so there's 4 copies at least extant of that speech she gives. They're all owned in Canada. But the book ends with that really remarkable speech advocating for women, particularly Black women, to get the vote, as an example of what it would have looked like in some ways for Eliza Harriet to have had the capacity to print her speech. But yeah, I so wish, and I think she didn't have children. And so, and she ends up basically more or less not indigent, but she's living in probably her executor's house. So whatever papers she had, to my knowledge, don't survive. And I actually tried to track down descendants who, everybody who's done this knows this. You write random people and they're like, what, who? I don't think I'm related to her, So, but I tried to track down her executor's descendants because she leaves her property to his daughters, but none of them had even heard of her.
Yeah, well, rather than ending on a story of people not hearing of her or don't have, in some cases, you have evidence of her students. In other cases, that doesn't exist. But what can be said about her influence on others? We can close with this question, really. What can be said about her influence on others, either in her own lifetime or afterward?
Yeah, that's where I know, thanks Scott for returning to that, because that's why the epigraph of the book to me is so important. She really, her epigraph is, the exertions of a female are an example to be imitated and improved on. And I really think that that's what she really believed. She did not believe everybody should do it exactly like her. She really, I think, believed she would be an example, but other people would push farther. And we know from other, just the enormous, wonderful work of Mary Kelly and other women who've written on female education, this is the period where female education really expands. And in that expansion, particularly in female-led academies, we begin to see other women, right, who are going to speak, who are going to teach, who are going to get employment from teaching and running schools. So I wish I could be like, the only person I know other than Washington who heard her lectures was Noah Webster, and he saw her as a competitor and decided they were dull. But I like to think that all sorts of young women heard her speak and walked away and were influenced just a little bit to push harder at the boundaries that they found themselves constrained by.
And that is a great note on which to conclude. Thank you so much, Mary Sarah Bilder, for this great conversation.
Thanks so much, Scott, for having me. And thanks to everyone for joining us tonight.
Indeed. Thanks to all of you who've been watching. If you'd like to recommend this program to friends, our public programs are available on the AAS YouTube channel. This will be on the AAS YouTube channel in the coming days. This summer, we have several programs coming up. The next one, which is virtual on June 15th, is with artist Brees Honeycutt. And the program is called A Bird to Overhear. And we're co-sponsoring it with Worcester's Ecotarium Museum of Science and Nature. In this program, we'll be sharing AAS collection material live from the archive, including a selection of Emily Dickinson manuscript poems. Our monthly Thursday afternoon book talks will also continue through the summer. Please check out these programs and more at our website, americanantiquarian.org, and watch previous ones on the YouTube channel. Thank you so much, Mary. Thanks to everybody in our audience tonight, and have a good evening.